I'm Hervé, I work at CERN, and I will try to give you a quick overview of what we do here at CERN with the networks, basically, because I understand that you're in a network workshop. So I entitled this talk From Detectors to Physics Discovery. So we will go from the detectors, the actual experiment, DLHC, that you have a picture behind me. I'm not actually in the tunnel. That would be bad for me. And then we will see how the data flows from the detector to the CERN Computer Center, to the scientific universities, scientific labs around the world. And then as well, the final step is the outreach. So how we can use data to improve the education of our young people. And then the next steps, because obviously physicists are very, very creative. So they always want more data and everything to be faster. So with this, let's move on up. So this is a satellite view of the Geneva area. So can you see my mouse? Okay, yes, you can. So on the right, you have the shore of the Geneva Lake. Here you have the Geneva Airport on the bottom right of the slide. And this is the Large Hadron Collider. So it's a 27-kilometer particle colliders where we have two beams circulating, each one of them in the opposite direction. And they meet at four interaction points where we have big experiments. So we have a CMS, LHCb, Atlas, and Alice. And here, so currently I'm sitting somewhere there, just for you, so that you see the scale of the installation. So this is what it looks like from inside. So as I said, it's a 27-kilometer tunnel. So people ride bicycles when the machine is off. It's composed of around 10,000 superconducting magnets, and they are cooled down to 1.9 Kelvin, so which is about minus 271.25 degrees. So that's very cold. So as I said, so we have two beams of particle rotating one in each direction, and they collide at the four experiment point. So now you might wonder, what do actually these experiments look like? So this is what Atlas looked like when it was being assembled. So this is 100 meters underground. You can see here there is one person. So this is quite big, and the whole central part of the detector is missing. So if we go to the next slide, we can see here a view of the detector once it's complete. I mean, computer generated, but that's the same. So the person that I showed you on the previous slide was sitting somewhere around here. So, and here you have some other people, just so you see the scale of the machine. So this thing here is 44 meters long and 25 meters high, and it weighs around 7,000 tons. And it's composed of something like 3,000 kilometers of cables. So, and what this thing, in fact, is just a super big camera, which takes 40 million pictures per second. So how do we, if we go to the basically data side, how does this work? So the experiment, the various detector, the calorimeter, the muon detector, the pixel tracker, etc., they're all connected to what we call a trigger, which is composed of different level of filtering. So the first level is made with custom hardware, so chips that have been built and engineered and designed at CERN. And here you have the event rate. So as I was saying before, we have 40 megahertz. So that's like 40 million of pictures per second. This translates to roughly 100 petabytes per second, which is quite a lot. And there is no way we can deal with that. So we have a first level of filtering of data where we basically remove the areas of the detector we are not interested in. Yeah, that kind of thing. And then we move on to a second level of filtering. So after the first one, we are already down to only 160 gigabytes per second. And then we have a second level of filtering, which is called the HLT for high level trigger. And what this thing does is that it so takes these parts of the detector and basically filters what we don't want or what we already know. And with this, we are down to 25 gigabytes per second, but still with today's means of storing data, this is still quite a lot. So then there are some other techniques that I won't enter here in detail to go down to 1.5 gigabytes per second, which is something that we can do without any problem. So this is the Atlas experiment. They have, I forgot to put a screenshot, but they have a very nice usage pattern. Basically, they say 1.5 gigabytes per second, but what we see on our side is more like bursts of 8 or 10 gigabytes per second. So on average, it is 1.5 gigabytes per second, but the infrastructure has to be designed to sustain much, much more. So then, okay, so this is a rough transition. So XRootD is it's a software framework that we use. Basically, it's something that was built in the high energy physics community. And as the website says it, it's a framework. It's a fully generic, basically data access, data storage framework, which can serve any kind of data and make it look like it's a hierarchical file system. Voilà. So I have a picture. Well, this is already much better. So this XRoot framework, this comes with basically a redirection model, so that the manager, the machine that knows where the files are, is not the bottleneck. So the user comes from the top, it talks to the manager, it can talk to them maybe a second level of management, and then finally, 1, 2, 3, 4 levels of managers or director. And in the end, it will talk to the storage machine or machines that have the files the user is interested in. So that's the XRoot framework. And on top of this framework, which is, if we think of a normal software, it's a bit like you have the Apache web server, and then you can build any kind of web application that you want on top. So our basically implementation of XRoot to have something that we can use at the scale we need for LHC, the LHC experiment is EOS. So on the left of the slide, you can see the general architecture from what the user sees. So the file, the user wants to access a file, it talks to the metadata server, which tells him, okay, who owns the file, when was it created, you can go there to get it. And then the user can go to the machine holding the file without going again through the metadata server. And on the right, you have the implementation. Okay, I won't enter the details here because it's outside of the scope of this talk. So this is the big picture of EOS. And I have a screenshot, I think, yes, of the installation we have here at CERN. So it's roughly 250 petabytes of data. So I think this was taken yesterday afternoon, and there was no data taking. Yes, so you can see here there was nothing going on, but still users were writing at around 2.5 gigabytes per second and reading at more than 20 gigabytes per second. So that's quite interesting. And for those interested in network, which I think most of you are, this installation is spread across 2 data centers. One we have here in Switzerland, and the other one which sits near Budapest in Hungary. And both data centers are connected via 3 links of 100 gigabits per second each. And obviously, because these links have only limited bandwidth, we try to direct the user to the replica of the file which is the closest to them, because we don't want to overload the link. So this is how data comes into the farm of the CERN Computing Center. Then the CERN Computing Center only accounts for around, I think, 20% of the resources available to the high energy physics and the LHC community. So for the physicists to be able to use the processing power and the storage capacity that they need, they came up with a thing called the grid. So I think this was designed in the early 2000s, and the grid, basically, it's like some kind of big worldwide distributed computing. It's called the WLCG, which stands for Worldwide LHC Computing Grid. So it's basically a multi-tier model where the tier 0 is CERN, so where we have the collisions and the experiments happening. So here at the center, we have the EOS storage system. And then the experiments, they will copy the data, some data. Usually we keep the raw data at CERN, and it is replicated to these tier 1s, to these tier 1 sites. So I think we have 13 tier 1 sites. With all of them, we have dedicated multiple 10 gigabit links. So there is no tier 1 in Australia, as far as I can say. So, but I think there is a tier 2. I mean, we'll come to that later. So yeah, so the tier 1s, these are 13 large data center. They have significant storage and computing capacity. So as I said, yeah, they account for like 80%. I mean, the rest of the capacity, computing and storage capacity of the LHC data. So they're responsible for safekeeping a proportional share of the raw data. The raw data is basically what comes out of the experiment, not what comes out of the detector, because this is way too much. And then some reconstructed data where we have the full tracks of the particles. They do large-scale reprocessing as well, and they're responsible for distributing the data to the next tier, which are the tier 2s. And the tier 2s, we have 160 tier 2 around the world. These are mostly university and scientific facilities or institutes. There is one in Melbourne, so I don't know where you're standing now, but maybe you know where this place is. So the tier 2s, they provide some storage and some processing power for specific activities. So if they have a group of physicists that are focusing on one specific subject, they will usually replicate the subset of data they're interested in their on their local facility. And it's very close to the user community, so they don't have to pay the price of the network latency or to transfer all the files. And then we have what we call tier 3, but they don't formally exist. It's when the scientists access the computing facilities through their local environment. A small cluster in the university department, so the person will usually just copy the files to its local setup and computer or cluster and work on it. There is no agreement with these tier 3. It's basically they do what they want. Then to move all this data, we came up with we looked at what was available, but there was nothing that was matching the scale that we wanted and that was as feature rich as what we needed to be. So some of my colleagues wrote something called FTS, which stands for File Transfer Service. It does what it says, so it transfers file. It's basically it's a bit like a batch scheduler, except for file transfer. So it supports multiple protocols. You can copy data, sets of data between protocols. So you can read from a protocol called readFTP, write to HTTP, or read from Xroot, the Xroot based storage systems like EOS, and write to HTTP based. You can even write or read to AWS S3 storages. It has built-in optimizer. So this is very interesting. So that in order to make sure that the network links and the storage system on both ends of the links are not saturated. So when we see the system starting to give errors, we will, the system will automatically adjust the number of concurrent transfers or the target bandwidth in each transfer so that we basically back off and make sure that we use the link or the system in the most efficient possible way without overloading them. It has a nice REST API, so you can script it, and the experiments have done extensive scripting. They basically plugged their own data management framework into FTS so that they don't have to deal with transferring the files. And it has very extended monitoring. So in case you're interested, this is a very nice piece of software. So I have a small screenshot. This is the optimizer. So, okay, so this is copying data from CERN to CERN. And we see, so here the destination system is having some problems because at the bottom of the screen you have basically the decision of the optimizer. So we had some problems, so we remove some concurrent transfers. Up, you see there the first one, poop, we remove one transfer, then transfers are going okay, the speed is increasing a little bit, so we increase the number of transfers, and then it's basically going like this all day long, as long as we have enough files in the queue. This is a different story. So I think that's it for FTS. Yes. So this is moving, I would say, all of the data from the big four experiments of the LHC from the tier 0 to the various tier 1s. So it's quite a huge amount of data. So this is over the last month, and you see we're averaging something like 20 gigabytes per second on average. Okay, except some days where I don't know what happened. Okay, so with the data distributed around, what can we do? Because this is good. We have the scientists doing stuff with physics, discovering particles, but this doesn't really help the general public. So here again, we came up with some CERN-ish service that is called SWAN. It's the shortcut for Service for Web-Based Analysis. It's a service that is based on the Jupyter Notebooks, so the former IPython interpreter. On top of that, below that, they plugged in the Root framework, which is an analysis framework that is very, very popular in the high energy physics. It has just been integrated with Apache Spark distributed computing platform, and it integrates with CERNbox, so basically on cloud with some CERN addition. If you're interested, you can click on the link later, or go to cern.ch/1. So I have screenshots here as well. Yes, so this is an example. Okay, so this is not physics data. This is for those of you who have never seen one of these Jupyter notebooks. It's very nice because you can mix titles, explanations with actual code. So here we are just generating some fancy heat map of the load average of machines inside a cluster. So already I think this already looks good because the explanations are not, not very detailed, but it's nice to be able to have the code and then the result of the code just below. And I think this is very good for sharing data and sharing as well the formulas and the formulas and the logic behind some results. So, okay, so I was stepping a bit, I was running too fast because now I'm moving on to the open data. And open data is really where we leverage all the tools to improve the educational content. So here again, we can use the SWAN web interface or the Jupyter notebooks as everyone else calls them or uses them to explain to students some high energy physics things. So I don't really know what this is, but it just looks nice. So you have some basically exercise, some code, and then okay, you can do this, you can do that, blah, blah, blah. We even have a nice integration with LaTeX formula rendering. So this is very nice. And then at the end, up, you get a nice plot. So that's very nice. And as it's interactive, so you can modify the code, change values live. It's really nice for students, so they can really make basically own the data and see own the whole process of that the scientists have done in the past. So this is really nice, and I know that a lot of people really enjoy that. So we have the Open Data portal, which is opendata.cern.ch. It has more than 1 petabyte of freely accessible data from the various LHC experiments. It has dozens, if not more, of Jupyter notebooks. So if you're interested, it's a really nice way of explaining high energy physics to the masses. And then, okay, so the next steps. So as I mentioned at the very, very beginning, physicists always want more. They want more data. They want everything to be faster. And they are very creative in in the means that they have to create new data. So they came up with something called the high luminosity LHC. So it is basically an upgrade of the current LHC. So we are here in 2018. So the units, they are funny physics units. It's inverse femtobarns. So we see today, we generate something like 20, 30 inverse femtobarn per year. Then we will enter a period of long shutdown, and then we will go into what we call the run 3. So here the data we could still cope with the amount of data we would receive for the next 3 years. But then there is something called the LS3, and during the LS3, which stands for long shutdown 3, they will upgrade the machine to have higher trigger rate, higher luminosity. So this means more collisions per second, and obviously more data. So you can see it increases quite dramatically, because if we end up before the shutdown to 300 inverse femtobarns, we will reach something like 3,000, so 10 times more by the time that the HLLHC is working at its full potential. So what does it mean in terms of data? So this means, so the first year of production of the upgraded LHC or the HLLHC, we are expected to deal with 600 petabytes per year, where today we are more at around like 50 petabytes. And if we then take into account the derived data, so the data generated from the raw data, reconstruction, etc., today we are dealing with 80 petabytes of data. In like 10 years, okay, in 9 years, we would have to deal with 900 petabytes, so like almost 1 exabyte. And if we see okay, I'm not running CPUs, but if I CPUs, we would have to come up with a way to run 60 times more to have CPUs that can perform 60 times more operations than we have basically today. And the problem with all this is that the technology only gives us like 20% increase per year, because obviously this is a flat budget. So it only gives us like times 6 or 10 in 10, 11 years, which is, for storage, it's almost okay, but for CPU, it's definitely not okay. So then we have some people around here that are working on maybe ways to deal with this. And one of the ways they came up with is what they call the data lake. So this is what is being experimented or investigated at the moment. It's basically multiple sites that are working together, and instead of having a hierarchical view like we have today, where we have tier 0, which has to have huge bandwidth capacity and storage and everything, everything would be spread across the globe, so which would put much more stress on the networks. And then what this thing would allow us, we don't see it in the slide, but basically site A could be some aggregation of smaller sites where they don't have the necessary skills or manpower to manage a storage system or a computing site. And then to ensure that the data is stored efficiently and the CPUs are used in the right way, the team of the data lake, they're coming up with basically workflows. So you could have a file that has just been created that is hot off the detectors, so to say, which is very, very hot because it's being reprocessed all over by a lot of CPUs. So then we have multiple replicas of this file. You can see we have one with the orange dot there at site A and site B. And then we have an archive of this file on the tape library of site C. And then maybe what can happen is that some physicists or some group of physicists, they want to reprocess some data. So some files that were not really used in the past, they become very famous again, very hot. So we can like take them back from tape. We promote them to first to disk-based storage, and eventually, if it really gets hot, to flash-based storage, and then we can even replicate the files across many nodes to ensure proper utilization of the CPU cycles. Because if they wait for the machines, for the disk server, for the storage machine to deliver data, it's wasted CPU, so it's not very good. So this is something that is being worked on at the moment. You can see that we can plug external resources like, I don't know, cloud providers, Amazon, Google, etc. But inside the data lake, we would have some core sites which would be connected via very high speed link. So here it's mentioned, it says terabit per second. So that's quite interesting, I think. And this is, okay, yes, so we already have a working prototype of this. As you can see here, so ARNet is part of it with one machine, as far as I can see. Yes. So yeah, we have something working. So this is very nice. It helps us to improve the software quite a lot, so that we are ready for the big challenges that are coming. This is being done in partnership with all these institutes. I noticed there are only 8, so sorry, the picture is not complete. So if you know one national facility that wants to participate in the project, they are more than welcome. And then, yeah, just to finish, because I haven't shown you one of the results of all this journey of the data from the detector to basically the end product, which is this. So this is again the Atlas experiment. You recognize basically the big magnets from the picture with the man standing in the middle. And here we have Higgs boson decaying to 4 gluons. So these are the 4 red things that you can see here. Voila, I think this is the end of the talk, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, exactly. So thank you very much for listening to me. And if you have any questions,
please thank the. Hervé, thank you. A couple of things stood out while the crowd thinks of questions you'd like to ask, and our